We have with us Dr. Gregory Shushan, who will talk about near-death experiences and the origins of afterlife beliefs, exploring how NDEs impact the afterlife beliefs of different societies around the world and the interactions between individual, culture, and extraordinary experiences. Dr. Shushan is the author of 2 books and has conducted research at Oxford University's Ian Ramsay Centre for Science and Religion, the Religious Experience Research Centre at University of Wales Trinity St. David, the Centro Incontri Umani at Ascona in Switzerland, and the Institute of Archaeology at University College London. Without further ado, I will clear the stage for our speaker.
Great, thanks, Mark. So in this talk, I want to talk about near-death experiences and how they have been the basis for afterlife beliefs in different cultures around the world. As everyone probably knows here, of all audiences, the near-death experience is a spontaneous, evidently universal occurrence in which the soul seems to leave the body during a period of clinical death or near death. Sometimes it can also happen spontaneously. Sometimes it can happen when a person believes that they're near death but aren't actually in any serious physical danger. And during that time, after they revive, they report that they had various kinds of sub-experiences or episodes that they almost invariably interpret in religious or spiritual terms. Some of the main sub-experiences are leaving the body or out-of-body experience, abbreviated to OBE, seeing the body below, entering darkness and then emerging from darkness, meeting deceased relatives, coming out into a place of light and encountering a being of light, which is identified with different kinds of religious figures or possibly none, just a sort of generic being of light, or sometimes ancestors or relatives are also radiating light. There's some sort of judgment or evaluation of a person's earthly life, and an encounter with reaching a limit or obstacles or barriers that can't be passed at that point. And then there's a journey to another realm. Sometimes they get a glimpse of the other realm, and there's also oneness, divinization, and ultimate reality. Obviously, there's also other sub-experiences within all those. It's as everyone here probably also knows, the definition of near-death experience is a little bit difficult as far as determining exactly which experiences make it up, how many of those experiences you need to have to actually classify it as an NDE. So the way I look at it is there's a sort of range, a repertoire of sub-experiences from which different NDEers can basically draw upon, not deliberately, but their experience is made up of a number of these, some of which will be similar to others and some aren't. There's also positive after effects upon revival, which a lot of people report. They get spiritually transformed. They have new insight, new spiritual orientation. They're kinder people, things like this. Documentary reports of NDEs are known from around the world and throughout history. Here's just a few images of NDE-related themes of people leaving their bodies and having judgment. And the one on the bottom right is an illustration of an NDE by a Kiowa Native American, which is a pretty interesting, unique example. But it's important to illustrate that NDEs vary widely across cultures. So it's not just a matter of certain people have certain experiences, but they're experienced in very specific cultural ways, almost as if there's a background experience and then culture gets laid on top of that experience. So for example, in small-scale societies, pretty much exclusively, we have reports of souls who walk along a road to get to the other world rather than ascending and going into the other world in this kind of disembodied form. I don't think that they are saying that their physical bodies got up and walked to the other world, because everybody can see that that didn't happen. But that's the way they envision it or experience the transition from this world to the next world. They also, in small-scale societies, often have the idea of the other world being located in some kind of earthly locale, like a cave or a volcano or underwater or something like this. That's not a very cross-cultural type of motif other than in small-scale societies. And then returning to the body is obviously a universal NDE motif. Otherwise, we wouldn't have anybody telling us about their NDEs if they didn't return to the body. But the reason for that return varies quite a lot in different cultures. So for some cultures, for example, they're told by some being of light, or they even decide themselves that they need to go back to Earth in order to fulfill something that they didn't fulfill and that they wanted to do, or to care for some individual, a parent or a child, or maybe have some kind of task to tell other people about the afterlife or whatever. But in other cultures, it's a case of mistaken identity quite often, where they got the wrong Gregory Shushan, and they'll send me back to my body and go pick the right one who lives in Persia or whatever. Somebody else who was had the same name, but they confused us in the other world. So, as with any experience, NDEs are rooted in the culture of the person having it. They're processed, interpreted, and expressed in different ways, depending on religion, language, society, and environment. So in other words, how the experience is experienced by any given individual is going to be different. This is why no two NDEs are exactly alike. And this is something that has often troubled not only near-death researchers, but people who have NDEs. They want them to be kind of all the same, because then it's easier to analyze them and it's easier to come up with an explanation for them, whether they're all the same because it's a manifestation of the special effects of a dying brain, or they're all the same because we're all accessing the same spiritual reality. But it's not really that simple. I'm not going to go into it too much today, because it may be in the questions, but I'll just get out of the way that I don't think the dissimilarities of NDEs are a deal breaker for there being an afterlife. I don't see any reason why an objective afterlife has to be the same for everybody, because this life isn't the same for everybody. And there's, I think, a lot of philosophical and metaphysical ways of explaining possible ways that there could be an afterlife in light of all the differences. But one similarity that is virtually universal is that the NDE is pretty much always interpreted by people who have them as an indication of what happens when we die. So if somebody feels they're close to death, they go to the other world after leaving their body and meet these different beings, spiritual beings, and come back. Not many people, except unless you're Susan Blackmore, say that was just my dying brain. Most people think I died, I had this experience, that was an objectively real experience, and now I'm back, and now I believe in the afterlife. So now this idea that religious and supernatural beliefs can originate in extraordinary experiences has a long and very prestigious pedigree, going back at least as far as E.B. Tyler. He wrote that men whose spirits, traveling in the hallucinations of extreme illness to the land of the dead, have returned to reanimate their bodies and tell what they have seen. He argued that such experiences actually formed the foundations for afterlife beliefs in different cultures. And Andrew Lang, a few years later, argued something very similar. It's important to note that Tyler was writing, over 100 years. He was writing in 1871, I think, which was over 100 years before Raymond Moody's Life After Life in 1975, which popularized NDEs, named the term near-death experience. And so that's to stress, really, that people have been having NDEs for as long as people have been writing and thinking and probably being alive, but that the term near-death experience only popularized them in 1975. So similar observations were made about NDEs by all these scholars as well, and many more. This is just a few examples of bigger names who in anthropology or religious studies who noticed the phenomena of near-death experience before it was named, before it was popularized, and saw it as a discrete type of phenomenon. Anthropologists in particular have been pretty astute in identifying these experiences and engaging with their implications. In the 1950s, Ake Hultkrantz, the lower guy in the middle, he found that NDEs in Native American cultures were seen as a separate phenomena by Native American people themselves, distinguished from dreams or visions or other kinds of hallucinations. And most crucially, that most of all these Native American societies placed a particular importance on NDEs that they did not place on the visionary and dream experiences. He concluded that Native American afterlife journey myths were inspired by religious experiences, and that these basic experiences have been constantly renewed within the frame of religious life. And there he's talking partly about the transmission of these accounts of journeys to the other world, which are mythologized into what he called Orpheus myths, but also kind of reinvigorated and replicated through shamanic activities, which I'll get back to a little bit later. Irving Hollowell, another anthropologist, wrote this very similarly, that afterlife journey myths were inspired by religious experiences, and that these basic experiences have been constantly renewed. Sorry, that was Hultkrantz again. Hollowell said that afterlife beliefs cannot be viewed as simple dogmas that gain currency without appeal to observation and experience. Specific individuals are referred to in the accounts of NDEs, and the historicity of these people, these individuals, is not in question. He said, when I made inquiries about life after death, it was the alleged experiences of these individuals that was first mentioned. So basically he's saying that these people are telling him, we got our afterlife beliefs from people who died and came back and told us what happened in the other world. And a lot of these people, by the way, especially when it comes to the more recent scholars, are not referencing these earlier scholars. So it's really a case of independently coming up with very similar theories. This ethnographer and psychologist Holger Kawait said, when asked about the origins of their knowledge of the beyond, the members of various cultures say they gain this knowledge from the experiences of those who've returned and from shamans. In a survey of 67 small-scale societies around the world, Dean Shields found that 95% of them believed in out-of-body experiences. And from that, he concluded that when different cultures at different times and in different places arrive at the same or very similar out-of-body belief, we begin to wonder if this results from a common experience of this happening. There's quite a few others in various disciplines who've come across this kind of theory or who have supported it. Neuroscientist Roger Walsh, religious studies scholar Paul Badham and Alan Seagal, as well as Alan Kelleher, James McLennan, and David Hufford. David Hufford coined the term experiential source hypothesis for this dynamic, and I'm going to use that throughout this talk. I think it's a very useful term. He said there are classes of experience that give rise to spiritual beliefs among practically all who have them, regardless of their prior beliefs. The perception and interpretation of such experiences are similar among persons with very different backgrounds and expectations. And James McLennan, who I know has given a paper at this symposium, wrote, although wondrous events are part of a symbiotic process in which culture shapes narrative accounts and the accounts in turn affect experiential reports, the thematic elements in common with wondrous accounts have had an impact on religious ideologies, contributing to cross-cultural convergences. These common features include beliefs in spirits, souls, heavens, hells, etc. And again, these ideas are not predicated on belief in an afterlife or claiming that NDEs are actually metaphysical occurrences. Neuroscientist Thomas Metzinger was writing about out-of-body experiences, and he said, for anyone who actually had that type of experience, it's almost impossible not to become an ontological dualist afterwards. Out-of-body experiences almost inevitably lead the experiencing subject to conclude that conscious experience can, as a matter of fact, take place independently of the brain and body. He doesn't necessarily believe that those experiences are consciousness leaving the brain and body, but that they're convincing enough and real enough and experientially real enough that they're enough to convince a person that they are what they appear to be. Obviously, I'm not claiming that afterlife beliefs all around the world, everywhere, are influenced or predicated on NDEs. For most, we don't know either way. I'm a historian of religion, so I don't even deal with living people who can clarify these things for us. But in many cases, looking at the historical material, there's enough similarities between NDEs and afterlife beliefs that we can make a reasonable connection between them. And that was really the kind of basis of my first study, which I started when I was doing my Egyptology degree in London. I noticed that there were parallels between ancient Egyptian afterlife texts and modern near-death experiences. And I started wondering if afterlife beliefs in other cultures were also similar to what NDEs tell us. So essentially, I was testing the experiential source hypothesis by means of a cross-cultural comparison of afterlife beliefs. The idea was that if afterlife beliefs are consistent all around the world, they can't just be products of culture, as current academic paradigms so often insist. There would have to be some kind of common foundation to them beyond culture, and what could be a more obvious place to look than the type of human experience that is most relevant to near-death experiences, to afterlife beliefs, which is near-death experiences, a spontaneous experience that happens universally. So I compared the earliest religious texts from the world's earliest civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, and Maya and Aztec. For the most part, all these civilizations developed independently over the course of around 4,000 years and are quite geographically isolated from one another. And this is what I found, that all of these civilizations shared these 9 fundamental beliefs with near-death experiences. And as well as certain civilizations had other NDE elements as well, but these were the ones that were the most consistent. I'm just going to briefly run through how this works so you can get an idea of the kind of methodology and function of how this all played out. So for example, the out-of-body experience in Egypt was symbolized by ascending on a stairway, on smoke, on a ladder, or the previous slide I showed where there's a bird hovering above the corpse. That's a representation of the soul leaving the body. In Mesopotamia, there were various descriptions of gods who travel to the other world, who have left their body, meeting their spirits out of their body. In India, there's references to a spirit that shakes off its corpse and rises from the body. In China, there are overt references to OBEs, things like when I no longer have a body. In Mesoamerica, there's also various references to ascent and ascending from a corpse and encountering the corpse and things like that. A corpse encounter, which is I also see as the NDE theme of when you rise above the body and see the body lying there below, again is evident in the texts of all these civilizations. The corpse of Osiris is seen in the other world, and the individual who has just died is associated with Osiris, so it's essentially an encounter with your own corpse. There's a corpse of the goddess Inanna in the other world. So I should hasten to clarify that these are not descriptions of NDEs. They're afterlife beliefs, and they're mythological descriptions of journeys to the other world. It's just that they share these NDE features. So darkness and tunnel is that's not even something that needs to be interpreted. They just describe going into darkness or some dark cave. Same with deceased relatives. The relatives change just as they do in NDE accounts. It can be your father, or your mother, or whoever, child. Being of light, again, is a very clear, obvious type of description. Various deities radiate light. The most common one was a sun god in each of these kinds of religions. And what's interesting is that the sun god often assists in the process of judgment or evaluating of the person's life. Just as in contemporary NDEs, the being of light also assists in the process of the life review or whatever form of self-assessment one is going to undergo. So there's a great quote, I titled a paper about it from a Native American source where the person actually says, the sun told me I was going to return to life, and also assisted in that life review. The life review or some kind of conduct evaluation, again, evident in very culturally specific forms in all of these cultures. And barriers and obstacles and limits. One thing that appeared quite often, which is interesting, was some kind of interrogation, like, what are you doing here? Do you know the nature of reality? Do you know the nature of your current existence right now? It's almost as if they're trying to get the soul to understand that they are a soul, that they have survived their bodily death, and that they're still existing in this other realm. And then there's just the idea that going to another realm, and that realm is often seen as the true home or the origin point. And then there's also divinization, oneness, enlightenment. Lots of NDEers talk about feeling like they're at one with the universe and things like that. One of the earliest examples that might actually be an NDE is from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which actually the Sumerian version is called Bilgamesh. It was named something different at that time. And it describes how he was lying on his deathbed, travels to the other world, undergoes a life review assisted by deities. He has a transformative experience in which his heart is assessed by a being of light, which is the sun god, and then he's transformed into a semi-divine state. He meets deceased relatives and then returns to his body and awakens. So that's possibly the world's earliest NDE, because Gilgamesh was an actual, people believe anyway, that he was an actual Sumerian king. There are also a couple of documentary NDE accounts from ancient China, references in ancient India, and one also from Mexico. So this combination of a knowledge of NDEs, myths with NDE-like journeys, and beliefs with NDE-like content all suggest to me that there's a direct link between beliefs and related experiences in the form of near-death experiences. So at least some afterlife beliefs actually originated in near-death experiences in all of these religions. That was the subject of my first book, which you can, it's a lot to try to summarize in a couple of minutes, but if you want to pursue it, follow it up and read about it in more depth, it's actually just gone out of print, but there's going to be a new edition coming out before too long. The second study I did was a very different approach. I looked at indigenous societies in 3 world regions, the Pacific, North America, and Africa. And again, I used the earliest accounts available from missionaries, explorers, and anthropologists going back as far as the 16th century and as recent as maybe mid-20th century. This was a very different kind of approach because, for one thing, I had a lot more evidence directly referencing NDEs, as well as dozens of personal accounts of NDEs. So in the Native American sources alone, I found 70 descriptions of NDEs or actual personal accounts of them, which is a lot. And just to put it in perspective, before this research, there were maybe, 12 or 15 NDEs from indigenous societies known from around the world. So I found 70 just for Native Americans. But the crucial thing here is at least a third of them, over 20 something, also included overt statements that their afterlife beliefs originated in the near-death experience. And here's just a few different cultures where that was the case. In the Pacific, similarly, from Polynesia and Melanesia, I found 36 NDEs or references to them, and 19 of those had statements that their afterlife beliefs originated in the experience. So that was a clear validation of the experiential source hypothesis. But of course, it's a lot more complex than that. It's not just, this is the way it is everywhere around the world, because there are also major differences in attitudes towards NDEs in different cultures. So this study ended up being a little bit steered towards differences rather than similarities, and trying to explain why some cultures, like the Native Americans, Polynesians, and Melanesians, valorized NDEs and incorporated into their afterlife beliefs, and their afterlife beliefs reflect NDEs, while other civilizations, or small-scale societies, especially in Africa, Australia, and Micronesia, had a very different kind of picture. Generally speaking, in African accounts of NDEs are very rare, and so are afterlife journey myths, which is very important clarification or a statement to make, because the lack of NDEs is corresponding to a lack of afterlife journey myths and a lack of NDE-like afterlife beliefs. Instead, African religions focused a lot more on the presence of ancestor spirits on Earth and also avoiding their potentially harmful influences. Shamanism in Native American cultures was often related to visionary experiences and traveling to the other world to rescue the soul of somebody who might be in danger of dying. Shamanism in Africa was more about avoiding spirit possession, witchcraft, sorcery, and things like that, rather than soul travel. So in contrast to the 70 or so Native American NDE examples I found, in Africa there were just a handful. And in contrast to the over 20 Native American statements that their afterlife beliefs originated in NDEs from African societies, I found 2. So those 2 were also from Bantu societies, and Bantu societies have more afterlife myths and more beliefs that were similar to NDEs. So the Bantu examples are basically the exceptions that prove the rule of the experiential source hypothesis relating to particular cultures. And what's interesting also about the African example is that NDEs themselves were often seen as a negative, in a negative light. So it's not that we don't have any examples or references to NDEs, it's just that they're described very differently, or from the point of view, not of the person who had it, but of the society at large. So there's an example from 1880 from Madagascar, where if a dead person revived, they would be immediately stoned to death. In 1875, a Zulu near-death experiencer was almost killed again on suspicion that they had been revived by witches. So that person is not going to be greeted and welcomed, and the family clustering around and saying, it's a miracle you came back. That's more like, uh-oh, this person is possibly possessed, and they're going to wreak havoc on our society if we don't deal with them in the proper way. Also in West Africa, it was believed that people who returned to death were possessed by spirits. And in Nigeria, it was recorded that people had a deep-seated terror of disembodiment. So these are essentially not, culturally receptive places for NDEs to even be talked about. There were cultural restrictions placed on the very idea of it. So people aren't going to talk about them, and people aren't going to spend a lot of time trying to bring an apparently dead person back to life. So on the one hand, these examples show knowledge of NDEs, which is really significant because you still get people, Richard Gottlieb in the New York Review a few years ago said, there are no examples of near-death experiences across cultures. So you still get people saying this. So the fact that even in a society that sort of demonizes NDEs, there's still evidence of NDEs in them. That's, I think, really significant. But it's also significant to acknowledge the varying ways in which cultures can respond to the phenomena and incorporate them into their belief systems, either in negative or positive ways. So we have the Native American Polynesian examples incorporating them in positive ways, and we have Australian and African and Micronesian examples incorporating them as a sort of thing, a negative example of something not to do coming back to life. There's also an inextricable link between shamanic journeys to the other world and near-death experiences. And in some cases, it's clear that shamanism is actually intended to replicate NDEs and even interfere with the process of somebody having an NDE. And what I mean by that, if a shaman is called upon to rescue the soul of somebody who's dying, that shaman will through whatever means of drug use or chanting or repetitive dancing or whatever, their soul will leave the body and they will travel to the same other world that the near-death experiencer is going to and coax that soul to come back to their body. So NDEs were not only influencing beliefs, but they're also influencing ritual and spiritual activities in the form of these kind of shamanic practices. And in fact, some shamanic afterlife journeys really seem like deliberately induced NDEs because they result from such extreme privations and massive quantities of drug use. There's a great example from the 17th century. The Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia, according to a French missionary, not only based their afterlife beliefs on one man's particular NDE, but that man later then taught people different kinds of shamanic techniques that would enable them to undergo their own journeys to the spirit world to essentially replicate the kind of experience that he himself had. And NDEs were also instrumental to the formation of different kinds of Native American revitalization movements. Let me just skip ahead there. Such as the Ghost Dance and the Indian Shaker Church. In these religions, the founder actually had an NDE and then started these religions based upon the teachings that he gained in the other world, and then also, again, conveyed different techniques to access that other world, democratizing near-death experiences to people so you don't have to die in order to have one. And the same pattern is found in religious revitalization movements in other parts of the world, including the Pacific and South America as well. And just another example to cement that difference between Native Americans examples and African examples, there's a really interesting religious revitalization movement that began in 1704 in the Congo, where a prophet named Beatrice Kimpavita died and then returned to life. And this religious revitalization movement grew around her. But it wasn't the NDE that was the significant thing about her religious cult. It wasn't the fact of her return. It was the fact that when she returned, she was claimed to be possessed by the spirit of Saint Anthony. So possession is a lot more culturally understandable and relatable than disembodied adventures in other worlds. So with the small-scale societies, you can delve deeper into that in my second book, which is this one. Hopefully that's going to have a paperback before too long. I'll just kind of wrap up by saying that NDEs are also relevant possibly to other kinds of beliefs. Judgment and life review encourage righteous behavior. It's possible that beliefs about gods themselves even originated in NDEs, because you have this encounter with beings of light, and all these other kinds of entities. So it might not be just afterlife beliefs that NDEs are influencing, but these very fundamental beliefs that religions around the world have. Almost everybody who's had an NDE, as I kind of hinted at before, genuinely believes that they temporarily left their body, encountered these spirit beings, went to other worlds, and so on. So it's understandable that they would interpret the experience exactly as what it appears to be. And this happens even with atheists. There's a famous example of the materialist philosopher A.J. Ayer, who had an NDE that completely changed his views of his own philosophy. And he said, "I saw a divine being. I'm afraid I'm going to have to revise all my various books and opinions." Research in cognitive psychology has shown that people have an intuitive belief that we're not just our bodies, and that our souls survive bodily death. I think this, rather than being an explanation that there isn't an afterlife, as some cognitive psychologists might have it, I think it actually supports the experiential source hypothesis, because it means that if we're predisposed to believe in an afterlife, that means we're going to be more receptive to experiences that seem to validate those kinds of intuitions. So as rational beings, we really need convincing reasons for our beliefs. We're not just these kind of walking automata that soak in whatever other people tell us. And near-death experiences offer just such a reason for belief in an afterlife. They authenticate and give form to what we're already predisposed to believe, according to cognitive neuroscience. Experiential validation is important to the establishment of new beliefs and also to the maintenance of existing ones, and is therefore a key factor in the formation of religions. Because human beings base our knowledge on our experiences, NDEs offer very rational, reasonable grounds for belief in an afterlife. So I'll just leave it at that, and hopefully we'll have some questions. Thanks very much for listening.